Hey, what's up guys? Today we'll use an API called REST countries in order to get and then present data about countries. For this purpose we'll use HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Let's go! So this is what we are going to create today. What's happening here behind the scenes is that just as soon as the page loads, we are making a request to the REST countries API. The API returns the requested data, and once we have the data, we can present it any way we want. In this case, we show the flag, the capital, dialing code, population, etc. Also note that a list with all the available options is dynamically populated. Obviously, in this case, the options are the countries provided by the REST countries API. And that's about it. Let's start coding. We will first create our working folder. We will name it REST countries API. We'll open our text editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code, which I think is awesome. However, you will obviously use your favorite text editor. Let's navigate to our working folder and create our index.html file. Visual Studio Code comes with a plugin called Emmet embedded. Emmet is a plugin which allows for high-speed coding and editing. If your text editor does not already have Emmet, you can easily add it. So now, for example, instead of having to type some boilerplate code for HTML5, we can simply type exclamation mark, hit tab or enter, and here it is. We have some boilerplate to begin with. However, this time we'll start with a clean sheet and start typing from zero. We have doc type, HTML. This is not an HTML tag, but it is an instruction to the browser to treat the page as an HTML5 document. We have the HTML tag, which tells the browser that this is an HTML document and it is the container for all other HTML elements. We have the head, which contains the metadata of the document, and the body, which contains the contents of the document. Very nice. Let's hit Ctrl S to save. And let's check what we've created so far. Let's open the index.html file. And as expected, it is still empty since we haven't added any content yet. By the way, is it really empty? If we right click and go to the page source code, we can see that it contains the markup saved up to this point. Okay, now let's put our page and the code side by side. Okay, I did it. And we can continue with adding the content. But let me first remove this minor distraction. Okay, so we have the title. I type title. It says Emmet abbreviation. Hit enter or tab and add the title. REST countries API. Save. And we expect the title to appear on the browser's tab. Hit refresh. There it is. We continue now with our content. We'll add a header, an h1 header, h1. There it is. And we'll add our main container. By the way, HTML is case insensitive, so we could also use capital case letters for the HTML tags, but it's like a convention. It's considered to be good practice to always use lowercase letters. So we have div main container. The main container will contain two sub-containers, one for the flag and one for the remaining info. Let's add the add flag container. Using emmet, we can type div flag container. In the special case of div, using emmet, we don't even have to type the div. We only have to type the ID. And div is assumed. Now, let's also add the other container, the info container. The flag container will only contain an image tag with the image of the flag. We'll leave the source and the alt attribute empty for now. They will be filled later with JavaScript as soon as we acquire the data. The info container will contain first of all the drop-down list. We can have a drop-down list using the select tag. With an ID of countries. The options of the drop-down list are called options. Again, the options will be populated dynamically via JavaScript as soon as we have the data. We can, however, add some dummy data, some dummy options for now. We can say option, let's say we want 3 options. We can use these with emmet. Here they are. Okay, let's see what we have so far. Here we are. Okay, up to this point, each time we saved a change to our document, we had to refresh the page in order to get the new state of the document. Visual Studio Code makes it very simple to run a live server which automatically reloads each time we save a change. All we have to do is click the Go Live icon here in the bottom, at the bottom. And that's all we have to do now. We don't need this tab anymore. So now the live server is listening for changes and automatically reloads each time we save a change. Back to HTML, we will need a few more pieces of information. First of all, we will need the capital of the country. And we will use a span with ID capital as a container for the dynamically acquired information. Next, we'll insert the dialling code of the country. Using emmet, we can write it like this: P with a span as a child, with ID dialling code. Okay. And we'll need 4 more pieces of information. We can say p times 4 with span as a child, and with ID. We'll not define the ID yet. Okay, the next one is population. And by the way, notice that if I save now, I don't have to refresh. It automatically reloads, and we can see the current state of the document. So the ID here is population. Next, currencies. Region. And subregion. Very nice. I think we are done with the HTML, and we can proceed to CSS for styling the page. For this purpose, we will add a new file and we'll name it style.css. Note that all files will be included in the same folder. And for testing purposes, let's add a background color to the body. Background color red. We save, and we observe that the background color is not red. That's because we haven't linked the external CSS file to the document yet. Let's do this right now. Link. And since our style.css is in the same folder, if the style file was not in the same folder, we would have to somehow navigate to the file using the appropriate path. Now we save, and the background is red. So now we've correctly linked our style sheet to the document. Going back to the style sheet, we can remove this beautiful red background color. And since the main focus of this tutorial is not on CSS but rather on functionality, let me just paste the CSS code and we'll quickly go through it. You can, however, find in the description a link to the whole project. We save to apply the styling. Here we are. Now let's quickly go through the CSS. The asterisk selector selects all elements. So any styling rule contained in here will be applied to all elements. In our case, we just want to reset the box sizing property from the default, which is content box, to border box. We continue with the body, nothing special here. Then we style the h1 header. Please note that this way we style all h1 headers of our document. In our case, we only have one h1 header, so this is okay, but in general we should be more specific with our selectors. Unless of course we wanted to reset the default behavior of all h1 elements or any other element. Next comes the main container. Nothing special here, we just set the width, margin and padding. And by the way, let's check it out from the DevTools. We can either hit F12 or right click and choose inspect. This is the main container, which has the flag container and the info container as children. That's why we don't have to set the width of the flag container or the info container, because since they are div elements and therefore block elements, they inherit the width from their parent element. For the flag container, we set the height, the background color and the border. The reason we set the height 252 and the width 502 is in order to achieve an aspect ratio for the image flag of 2 to 1. So having a width of 502, height 252 and border 1 pixel, we end up with an image of 500 pixels width and 250 height. This calculation has to do with the box sizing we previously mentioned. Next, we set the width and height of the image, which is contained inside the flag container. Note that browsers technically use display inline for the images. So technically images are inline elements, and as such we shouldn't be able to give them width or height. However, they are given special treatment, and they follow all traits of an inline block. So we can set width and height to an image. But in our project, we don't want the image to be inline anyway, so in order to avoid any confusion, let's just set display block for the image. And let's check it out here in the DevTools. Flag container, image, here it is. Next comes the select drop-down list. Again, nothing special here. Display block, margin, padding, min width 100%. We wanted to take all the available width, color, font size, and this is a quick fix I found from Stack Overflow in order to center the selected option. If we didn't have this, it would be aligned to the left. Just a matter of taste. Next, we style the paragraphs of the info container and the span of the paragraphs. It's empty for now, but nothing special here, just playing with padding and font weight. And finally, we add some very basic responsiveness. In this case, if the width of the screen, or viewport should I say to be more precise, is equal or less than 768 pixels, then these styling rules apply. Otherwise, they do not apply. Now, what do these rules say? Well, basically we just decrease the font size and also decrease the width and height of the containers. So if we decrease the viewport width, we can see the new rules come into effect. And that concludes the CSS part. Let's continue with adding the functionality with JavaScript. We'll first create the JavaScript file. Let's name it main.js. Here we are. And for testing purposes, let's just alert something. It's not working yet. We can't see the alert, and that's because we don't point to the external JavaScript file yet. Let's do this right here at the bottom of our page, just above the body closing tag. That's because we are in the same folder. Remember, everything is in the same folder. So now if we save, here it is. So up to this point, we are correctly pointing to the external JavaScript file. So we are good to go. But first, let's just take a moment to explore the REST countries API. This is it. Okay, REST countries. Get information about countries via RESTful API. This is the documentation of the API. It's almost as simple as it gets. The endpoints. This is the endpoint to get the data for all countries, and actually this is the one we are going to use in our project. Let's see what this endpoint returns. Okay, and by the way, if your data looks like this, like the raw data, it's because you haven't installed a Chrome extension called JSON formatter, which basically just formats the data in order to make it easier for us to read the data. So what this endpoint returns is an array of objects, each object representing one country, actually the information of each country. It's in alphabetical order. This is the first country, Afghanistan. So we have the name, top level domain, alpha 2 code, alpha 3 code, the 2-letter and the 3-letter code of the country, calling codes, capital, some other info, region, sub-region, population, latitude, longitude, etc. Borders, the bordering countries, currencies. Again, currencies are an array of objects, each object describing the currency. Languages, again an array of objects. Flag, so we have a URL for the flag of each country. Here it is. Okay, anyway, so let's see the dimensions of the flag. It's 600 width and 400 height, so it's 3 to 2 the aspect ratio. As you recall, we used 2 to 1 aspect ratio for the flag images, so this specific image might look a bit distorted. Unfortunately, this API does not provide flag images with consistent aspect ratio. That's okay for this example project. Obviously, in a real life project, we would be more thorough. Okay. And that's all we need to know for our project. One could also search by country name, by country full name, by code, 2-letter or 3-letter code. For example, there it is, Colombia. We could also just type CO and we would still get Colombia. For example, with FR, you get France, and you get France with FRA as well. Okay, list of codes. You can get by currency and get all countries which use this currency, by language, by capital city. Let's see this example. Okay, so you write Paris, we get again France, by calling code, by region. So for example, now we'll get all European countries. Albania, let's look randomly, Belarus, Belgium, Bulgaria, etc. And that's all. Here is a response example. We've already been through an example, but again, basically we will only use this one. We'll make a single request to the API to get all the data for all countries. We'll store the data in a global variable, and that's all. We will not make any further requests to the API. So it's coding time. Just as soon as the document is ready, we want to retrieve data from the REST countries API and display it. We don't have to ensure that the document is ready because we know it is, since we've placed the script tag at the end of our document, just above the closing body tag. So we know that up to this point, the DOM content was loaded. In order to retrieve the data from the REST countries API, we won't use any JavaScript library such as jQuery with its Ajax method or Axios, but instead we will use the Fetch API, which is natively supported by most browsers. And let's see the browser support for the Fetch API. Fetch is a modern replacement for XML HTTP request. Here is the support. It's pretty good. It covers almost 90% of global usage. Nothing is perfect, but in this imperfect world, we should always try to make the optimal decision, optimal according to our judgment. Of course, if, for example, we expected the target audience for our application to be using Internet Explorer in a significant percentage, then we should make sure that our application works fine with IE as well. In order to get or fetch, should I say, data from the REST countries API, we'll use the fetch method. This is a global method provided by the Fetch API and which allows us to asynchronously fetch resources. The fetch method takes one mandatory argument and that is the path to the resource we want to fetch. Let me add the path, the URL. It's a URL to the REST countries API to get the data for all countries. Fetch returns a promise, which is a way to handle asynchronous operations without the need for a callback. In order to do something after the resource is fetched, we should use a then call. Let's console log the response. Okay, let's check it out in the DevTools. This is the response. Let me zoom in. So we can see that the request was successful. We have OK is true, status 200, but we can't see the data anywhere. So this HTTP response does not contain the actual data yet. It turns out that the requested data is hidden in the body as a readable stream. So we need to call an appropriate method in order to convert this readable stream into data we can consume. Since we get data in JSON format from the REST countries API, we can use the response JSON method to convert the data. So if we log the response.json, and by the way, there are other methods to deal with different types of response. If, for example, we are requesting a text file, then we should call the response.text function. Or if we were requesting an image, we should use the response.blob. In our case, we will use the .json. Okay, so we can see that this returns a promise, but let's explore a bit more. Okay, we can see some data here, and here we are. We are almost there, but what we want is the actual data without the promise status, promise value. So in order to achieve that, first of all, we don't just want to console log this, but we want to return it. JSON. Okay. Let's comment this out. And remember, this returns another promise, so we can get the data we wanted with yet another .then call. This is the actual data now. Let's console log the data. And here we are. So that's all we need to do to get data with fetch. The word asynchronous was mentioned a couple of times, and just to make sure we are on the same page, let's quickly define asynchronicity in the JavaScript context. So just with a quick Google search, we get a quote-unquote definition. Asynchronous actions are actions executed in a non-blocking scheme, allowing the main program flow to continue processing. With Ajax, web applications can retrieve data from the server asynchronously in the background without interfering with the display and behavior of the existing page. And let's quickly demonstrate this with an example. So here in the first line, we console log the number 1. And here we console log number 2. And by the way, something is wrong here. This should be above the return statement. If it goes below the return, it wouldn't be executed. And we want here the number 3. Let's comment this out. And finally, let's console log number 4. If we save, we can see here that first it logs number 1, then it logs number 4, and then it goes to 2 and 3. And that's exactly due to the asynchronous nature of the fetch function. So what happens here is the program executes the first line of code, continues to the second one, requests the data, and in the meantime, while waiting for the response, it continues processing, so it's not blocking the main flow of the program. And just as soon as the response is available, it returns to execute the code over here. And that closes the parenthesis about asynchronous methods. So let's move on. One thing we haven't mentioned regarding the fetch method is the error handling. For this purpose, let me intentionally create an error by requesting an invalid URL, an invalid endpoint, and let's console log the response. We can see there was an error. Let's explore the response object. We have OK is false instead of true. Status is 404. If you recall, it was 200 in the case of successful response. And we can see that the chain is broken here. It does not even proceed to the next then. So in order to catch the error and handle it, we will use the catch method. And suppose we want to alert the error to the user, just to let the user know that there was an error. And here it is. Nothing fancy, but lets the user know that there was something wrong. However, in our project, we will simply log the error. Here it is. And by the way, when using console log, we can simply use a comma to concatenate the string with the error variable. Okay, enough with error handling. So up to this point, we have the data. What we want to do next is initialize the page. In other words, we want to populate the select options list with the actual data, not these dummy values. And we also want to display the information of a country, let's say the first country of the list for starters. So we could write the code here, or we could just call a function and include the code inside that function. We'll do the latter. Let's name the function initialize and pass in the data as an argument. Let's implement the initialize function here. Which takes an argument. We could name the argument data, but to be a bit more accurate, let's name it countries data. And just to make sure everything works fine, let's console log the countries data. But first, let's clear the console and let's comment this out in order to avoid any confusion. Okay, so we are good to go. But first, let's take a step back and rewrite the fetch method, replacing the anonymous functions here with arrow functions, just in order to make the syntax a bit more concise. So if we comment this out and save, we can see the console is now empty. Let's copy paste the first line. Then here comes the arrow function. We don't use the function keyword. We only write the parameters. In our case, we only have the response. Then comes the arrow. Notice that it is equal sign here, so we also call these functions fat arrow functions. It's not a simple arrow. And then comes the block body. In our case, this is the block body. And this is a valid arrow function. However, since there is only one single parameter here, the parentheses could be omitted. Moreover, since there is only one single expression inside the block body could be transformed into a concise body. And in a concise body, the return statement should be omitted, since the single expression here becomes the explicit return value. So now we'll work in a similar manner for the remaining functions. Then data, and if we save, again we get the data, and we can finally proceed with implementing the initialize function. As a first step, we'll assign the data to a global variable in order to be able to access it beyond the local scope of this function. So let's define the global variable here. Instead of the var keyword, we'll be using the let and the const keywords. Okay, so this global variable will have a global scope, and therefore all scripts and functions of our web page will be able to access it. And it will contain the fetched data. So countries equals countries data. Great, now we can access data from everywhere. So if we console log countries here, we should be able to see the data. However, we get undefined, and that's because, if you recall, this action is asynchronous. So at the time this line of code is executed, the data is not ready yet, and therefore this action never happened. What if we added some delay before executing this command in order to give time for the fetch request to be completed and the data to become available? Well, let's set timeout. Let's say 500 milliseconds. And let's see what happens if we save. Okay, so now we get the data. Very nice. And just out of curiosity, let's see what happens if we set the timeout to 200. Okay, it's undefined, so it takes longer than 200 milliseconds for this action to be completed. It's somewhere between 200 and 500, but anyways, I'm just playing here. Let's continue. We now want to populate the select list with options. The options string will be the inner HTML of the select element and therefore will eventually contain all available options. For this purpose, we'll loop through each country and add the corresponding option. Let's use the good old for loop. We'll use template literals, which were introduced in ES6. Template literals are basically string literals allowing for embedded expressions. They are enclosed by the backtick character instead of double or single quotes. You can most probably find the backtick character at the left of number 1 on your keyboard. But let's quickly go through an example to make sure we understand the usage of template literals. Suppose we wanted to log the capital of the first country in the list. If we didn't use template literals, then we would have to concatenate strings and expressions using the plus operator. So we would do it like this. Capital of plus countries 0 because we want the first country dot name. Recall that the property name for the country name is name. For the capital, it's capital. So plus is plus countries 0 dot capital. Okay, if we save, we can see capital of Afghanistan is Kabul. Okay, now using template literals, backticks, capital of, and now in order to embed a template literal, we use $sign and curly braces, and in here goes the expression. So capital of, we said the country is, and again dot happy. We save and we get the same result, this time using template literals. And by the way, here we could obviously use single quotes instead of double quotes and still get the same results. It's just a matter of personal preference. However, I would urge you to be consistent with the use of whatever you choose. Okay, now let's continue with the main flow of our project. So for each country, we want to add an option. Let's copy paste this line. And we want to replace the hard-coded values with data values. Now, as a value here, we would like a unique value for each country. This could either be the Alpha 2 code, the Alpha 3 code, or even the name of the country. We will go by the Alpha 3 code. Okay, let's continue here. Countries I. Remember, we are inside the loop now. Alpha. Okay, and now this value will be the displayed value, and it will be the name of the country. Let's copy paste. And that's all. Now, just in order to make some more space, let's hide this explorer here. And now let's add the options to the select list by setting the inner HTML of the list to options. So in order to access the select list, document dot get element by ID. What's the ID of the select list? It's countries. And by the way, we don't need these guys anymore. And if we save, now the list is empty. So the ID here is countries dot inner HTML, and this is now options. We save, and here it is. Now the list is populated with the names of the countries. And if we dig a little bit deeper, let's see. Now we expect that each option has the Alpha 3 code as a value. There is a list. So we can see the Alpha 3 code for each country. Okay. Alternatively, we could access the select list element by using the query selector method. Let's demonstrate this over here. So now if we save, the list is empty. So the query selector method takes a valid CSS selector as an argument and returns the first element within the document that matches the specified selector. So once we access the element, again we want to change the inner HTML to options. Save, and again we have the list of the countries. But eventually we'll assign the element to a variable in order to avoid typing this part or this part each time we want to access the element. So let's comment this out, save. Again, we have an empty list, and in global variables, let's create a variable. This time it's a constant variable, and name it countries list, and assign the element object to it. Save. And now here countries list dot inner HTML equals options. Save. And again we get the list with the countries. Now what if we wanted, for example, to add the dialing code next to each country, making the list a dialing code list? Well, that's very simple. Let me copy and paste this line. And at this point here we want to add the dialing code. And let's see what's the property name for the dialing code. Here it is, it's calling code. Notice that it is an array. I suppose maybe because in some countries there are more than one calling codes. However, we will always be using the first value of the array. So it's calling codes. Okay, let's save. And here we are. Now we have a list with the countries and the dialing code next to each country. So we have a dialing code list. Okay, however, in this project we'll just use a simple list with the countries. And so let's comment this one out. Let's uncomment this one. Save. And everything looks the way it was supposed to. And one last thing I would like to throw on the table before proceeding is the for each method. The for each method executes a provided function once for each array element. So we'll use the for each method in replacement for the for loop over here. So let's comment this out, save. Once again the list becomes empty. So now we have countries for each. So for each element of the countries array, the following function will be executed. Takes the element as an argument. It's for each element, but better let's name this country, since each element represents a country in the countries array. And let's just copy paste this line of code. And instead of countries I, we should just say country. And that's all, I think. Let's save. And once again, the list is populated with the names of the countries. Okay, let's continue. After assigning the data to the country's global variable and populating the select list with options, we want to display the information of the selected country or the selected option. This functionality will be provided by a function, and let's name that function display country info. The reason we chose to include this functionality in a separate function is in order to avoid code repetition and therefore keep the code as dry as possible, since this function will be called each time a new country selection is made. The display country info function takes the value of the option, which is the 3-letter country code, as an argument. On initialization, the selected country by default will be the first country of the list, and that is Afghanistan, which has AFG as a 3-letter code, and we can confirm that by navigating to the specific element. There it is, AFG. At the moment we'll hard code the 3-letter code, but we'll return to that just as soon as we explore a bit more the countries list element object. Okay, let's create the display country info function. And let's name the parameter country by alpha3 code. And as a first step, we want to store the data for the specific country in a variable. Let's name the variable country data. And we'll use the find method, which returns the value of the first element in the array that satisfies the provided testing function. Otherwise, undefined is returned. So we want the country which satisfies the following condition. So we want the country which has alpha3 code. Here it is. Equal to the provided argument. And let's console log. Country data. Here it is. So we get the data for Afghanistan. If here, for example, we had the 3-letter code for France, which is FRA, we would get the data for France. Very nice. We can now proceed to filling the information fields, and this should look familiar. The ID of the capital field is capital. And the property name for the capital is capital. And if we save, we can see the corresponding capital displayed. Next comes the dialing code. Let's copy paste this part. The ID for the dialing code field is dialing code. And the property name for the dialing code is calling codes and will present the first element of the list. Save. Here it is. And if we want the plus sign to be presented before the number, we can use template literals. save. Here it is. And now the population field. Again, let's copy paste this part. The population field has ID population. The property name for population is population. Let's save. And here it is. Now, if we want to separate thousands with commas, we can use the toLocalString method. Which returns a string representation of the number. But just in order to be sure that it works as intended, then we should add this argument. We won't expand on the toLocalString method here. Make sure to read the documentation before using it. The currencies field comes next. Again, let's copy paste this part. The ID of the currencies field is currencies. The name field for currencies is currencies. And notice that currencies is an array of objects, each object representing a currency. And what we want to do here is loop through each object in the array and print as a string the name of the currency and the code of the currency. For this purpose, we'll use the map method, which creates a new array with the results of calling a provided function on every element in the calling array. So for each currency, we want a string, but we'll use template literals for this purpose. We want the name of the currency, and in parentheses the code of the currency. Now, if we save, we get the currency name followed by the currency code. But what if we had a country with more than one currencies? For example, what if we had Cambodia, which is such a country? Cambodia has a 3-letter code of KHM. Save. And here we can see the currencies of Cambodia. Note that the result of this action is an array, and therefore we could use the join method to join all elements of the array into a string. So suppose we want to join the elements using a triple dash. Let's save, and this is the result. However, what we want to do is join them with a comma and a space. There it is, much better. Now, one last thing I've noticed is that for Zimbabwe, ZWE, I think is the 3-letter code, we get this weird value for the last currency. And this is actually due to a data error. So Zimbabwe is the last country in the list. These are the currencies, and the last currency is basically it's empty. We could of course ignore this minor typo. However, if we wanted to be perfectionists, we could make use of the filter method. The filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass a specified condition. So in our case, we would chain the filter method right before the map method. So this condition would always be true unless falsy, and it would be falsy only if it returned false, 0, an empty string, null, undefined, or NaN, not a number. So up to this point, we will have an array with all the valid currencies, and from this point on, the map method and the join method will work as previously described. So if we save, again we get the currencies, but this time without the invalid entries. Okay, let's continue with our main example. The region and sub-region remain. These two are trivial, so let's copy paste this line. The ID of the region field is region, and for the sub-region is sub-region. And the property fields are named again region and sub-region. Save, and we can see that all the text information is now displayed. The flag image remains. Let's add it right now. What's the ID of the image tag? We notice that we haven't added an ID for the image. We could add an ID, or alternatively we could use the query selector. We have the div with ID flag container, which contains the image. So instead of get element by ID, we could use query selector, and the selector would be flag container image, and we want to change the source attribute to let's see the property name field for the flag URL. Here it is, it's flag. And let's set the alt attribute, which provides alternative text if the image cannot be displayed. And let's set the alt attribute to, let's use template literals, flag of and country. Okay, let's save. Much better. So now the display country info function takes the 3-letter country code as an argument and returns the corresponding information. Let's just move this part over here just to keep the same order as the displayed one. Let's save. Everything seems to be working fine and we are getting closer. As a final step, we want to display the new country info each time a new country is selected from the countries list. In other words, the final step is to add an event listener which will listen for changes in the countries list and will display the new country info each time a change occurs. Let's add the event listener over here. The target of the event listener is the list, the countries list. The type of the event is change. So each time there is a change in the selected value of the list, the following anonymous function will be triggered. Let's quickly explore what this event argument is all about. So now we notice that each time we choose a different country, this anonymous function is triggered and the event object is displayed. We can see that the event object has many properties / methods, but in our case we are interested in the target property, which returns the element that triggered the event. So if here we say event.target, we expect to get the countries list element. Let's select. Notice that each time we select a different country, this function is triggered, and each time we get the select element. Now, in order to get the value of the currently selected option in the select list, we should use event.target.value. Save, and we notice now that each time we select a new country, the value of the option, which is the 3-letter country code, is logged. All that remains now is call the display country info function. Each time a new option is selected, passing the newly selected option's value as an argument. Now, if we save, we can see that each time there is a change in the current value of countries list, this function is triggered and the information of the newly selected country is displayed. We could of course use an arrow function here instead, and let's show how we would do it. So now if we save again we get the same result. And alternatively, we could also name the listener function. Let's demonstrate it right here. So here we would have the name of the function. Let's name it country function. Let's implement the function here. Save, and once more we get the same result. And that's all basically. So as soon as the page loads, we request the data, and as soon as the data becomes available, we display the data of the first country in the list, and from that point on we can select any other country, and the corresponding information will be displayed. By the way, we don't need this information to be logged in the console anymore. Let's remove this part. Now, one last modification would be to display the information of a random country on page load instead of the first country in the list. Let's do this right now. In the initialize function, after the countries list element is populated, we will replace the default option selection, which is always the first option in the list, with a randomly selected option, and eventually we will pass the value of this option as an argument to the display country info function call. Cool, let's first explore the countries list element. Hit save, and this should look familiar. It is the countries list element with its options. Now let's use the value method. And we've also been through this one. It returns the value of the currently selected option, which is by default the first option in the list. Next, let's use the length property, which returns the length of the countries list. It returns 250, so we know that the select list has 250 options. Next comes the selected index property, which sets or returns the index of the selected option in a drop-down list. So if we hit save, as expected, we get 0, since by default the first option is selected, indexing is 0 based, and therefore the first option has index 0. The last option of the list should have index 249, since we have 250 options in total. Now, what if we wanted to access a specific option of the countries list? Well, we could easily do that simply by declaring the index of the option we want to access. So if we want to access the first option of the list, this would have index 0. And here it is, we get the first option of the list. If we wanted to access the last list option, which is Zimbabwe, recall that in total we have 250 options, so the index for the last element would be 249. Save, and we accessed the last option of the list. What if we entered an index which does not exist, for example 250? In this case we would get undefined, since no option with index 250 exists. Okay, let's continue our example with the option with index, let's say 10. And what would that option be? We have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it should be Argentina. We save. Indeed, we get Argentina. Again, we can get the value of the option using the value property. Save. There it is, we get the value, and we can also get the text between the opening and closing option tag using the text property. Dot text, save. There it is. And now we can use some of the previously mentioned properties in order to get the value of the currently selected option, replacing the hard-coded value over here. Let's quickly do this. Countries list. The index would be countries list dot selected index dot value. Save. Again, everything works as expected. So what remains now is set the selected index to a random integer between 0 and 249. Let's first comment this out. And countries list dot selected index equals, notice that this time we set the index of the selected option. We don't just return it, but we set it, we assign a new value to it, equals math.random. This function returns a random number between 0 inclusive and 1 exclusive. So if we say math.random times countries list dot length, we get a random number between 0 inclusive and countries list dot length, in our case 250 exclusive. And we want to use this part as an argument for the math dot floor function, which returns the value of the argument rounded down to its nearest integer. So now this part returns an integer between 0 and countries list dot length minus 1. In our case, a random integer between 0 and 249. And that's all. So now if we save, we observe that each time we refresh the page, the displayed country is randomly selected. We can still, of course, select any option we like. We can also navigate using the arrow keys. And that concludes this tutorial. We won't expand any further. Obviously, once you have the data, there are tons of things you could do. For example, you could create a quiz and for a given flag, have the user name the country. or for a given country, have the user name the capital, or vice versa, given the capital, have the user name the country, or given the country, have the user name the region or sub-region if you want to increase the level of difficulty. What else? You could even create multiplayer games, and for a given country, have the users estimate the population of the country, and the user whose estimation is closer to the actual number is the winner. Have latitude and longitude, and I guess this point is approximately the center of the country. So for a given country, you could have a world map and have the users click on a point on the map, and the user who clicks closer to the center of the country is the winner. What else? We have borders. So you could, for example, create interesting diagrams presenting neighboring countries. In short, what I want to say is that once you have the data available and the technical skills, you can use your imagination to create beautiful, engaging, and useful applications. Thanks for watching. Feel free to comment, like or dislike, subscribe or unsubscribe. That is, if you are already subscribed. Take care. Bye.